Jake Big Rig Carter was no rookie. He had spent 20 years on the road, driving his 18-wheeler through every kind of terrain and weather imaginable. Rain, snow, pitch-dark nights, none of it fazed him. The highway was his second home. But one night, while hauling a shipment of lumber through the Appalachian Mountains, Jake encountered something he would never forget. The night began like any other. The air was cold, and a thick fog rolled in, cloaking the winding mountain roads in a ghostly white. Jake was used to these conditions. He adjusted his headlights to cut through the fog and kept his speed steady. His route took him along Route 68, a stretch of road truckers called Dead Man's Road because of its dangerous curves and steep drop. Jake chuckled to himself. "Just another spooky name," he muttered, sipping from his thermos of coffee. The road was deserted, save for the occasional animal darting across the asphalt. His CB radio crackled, but no one was talking. It was unusually quiet, even for a late-night haul. Around midnight, Jake spotted a figure on the side of the road. At first, he thought it was a hitchhiker, but as he got closer, he saw it was a woman. She wore a long white dress, and her dark hair hung loose around her face. She stood perfectly still, staring down the road. Jake frowned. He didn't usually stop for strangers, company policy strictly forbade it, but something about her made him hesitate. He slowed the truck and rolled down his window. "Ma'am, you okay?" he called out. The woman turned her head slowly. Her face was pale, and her eyes were wide and dark, as if she hadn't slept in days. She didn't answer. "Do you need a ride?" Jake asked, glancing at the empty passenger seat. She nodded once, almost imperceptibly. Jake sighed and put the truck in park. He climbed out and opened the passenger door for her. The woman climbed in silently, her bare feet brushing against the floor mat. "Where are you headed?" Jake asked, trying to keep his tone light. "Down the road," she said softly. Her voice was cold and distant, like the wind whispering through trees. Jake nodded and pulled back onto the highway. He glanced at her occasionally, but she kept her gaze fixed on the road ahead. "Long night?" Jake tried to make conversation. She didn't answer. As they drove, the fog thickened, making it harder to see. Jake slowed the truck, his hands tightening on the wheel. "This fog's a killer," he muttered, half to himself. "That's how they died," the woman said suddenly, her voice barely above a whisper. Jake felt a chill run down his spine. "Who died?" She didn't respond, just kept staring ahead. Jake shook his head. Probably just a local with a rough story, he thought. He focused on the road, but the silence in the cab was oppressive. After about 10 minutes, the woman spoke again. "They never leave this." Jake glanced at her sharply. "Who does?" She turned to look at him, and for the first time, Jake noticed tears streaming down her pale face. "The ones who crash here. They're still here. They're waiting." Jake's hands gripped the wheel tighter. "Ma'am, are you feeling okay? Do you need me to call someone?" Before she could answer, the CB radio crackled to life. "Jake. Jake, do you hear, ma'am?" Jake's blood ran cold. The voice was familiar. It was his friend, Ray, another trucker who had driven this route many times. But Ray had died 2 years ago in a fiery wreck on this very stretch of road. "Ray?" Jake whispered, his throat dry. "Turn back, Jake," the voice crackled. "Turn back before it's too late." Jake's heart pounded in his chest. He stared at the CB radio, unsure if he was losing his mind. When he turned to look at the woman, she was gone. The passenger seat was empty. Jake slammed on the brakes, bringing the truck to a screeching halt. He jumped out, shining his flashlight into the fog, but there was no sign of her. The road was completely deserted. "Impossible," Jake muttered, climbing back into the truck. His hands trembled as he gripped the wheel. He wanted to turn around, but the road was too narrow to safely maneuver the rig. He had no choice but to keep going. As he drove, the air grew colder, and the fog seemed to thicken even more. Shadows danced in the corners of his vision, but every time he turned his head, there was nothing there. Suddenly, his headlights illuminated something in the road ahead, a wrecked car, its body mangled and twisted. Jake slowed the truck and stopped a few feet away. He climbed down, his boots crunching on the gravel shoulder. The car looked ancient, like it had been sitting there for decades. The paint was rusted and the tires were flat, but what froze Jake in his tracks was the figure slumped over the steering wheel, a man with a bloodied face and empty eyes staring straight at him. Jake stumbled back, his flashlight shaking in his hand. He turned to run back to his truck, but as he did, he saw more figures emerging from the fog. They were people, men, women, and children. Some dressed in old-fashioned clothing, others in modern outfits. Their faces were pale and lifeless, their eyes hollow. They moved slowly, their footsteps eerily silent. Jake scrambled into his truck and locked the doors. He started the engine, but the figures were now surrounding the vehicle, their ghostly faces peering through the window. "Go back," one of them mouthed, though no sound came from their lips. Jake floored the accelerator. The truck roared to life, and he drove straight through the fog, the ghostly figures vanishing into thin air as he passed. The fog began to thin, and soon Jake found himself on a familiar stretch of highway, the first rays of dawn breaking over the horizon. He pulled into the next truck stop and parked his rig, his hands still trembling. He climbed out and leaned against the side of the truck, taking deep breaths. His head was spinning, and his heart felt like it would never slow down. An older trucker approached him, concern etched on his face. "You okay, buddy? You look like you've seen a ghost." Jake chuckled bitterly. "Maybe I have." The trucker frowned. "You didn't take Route 68, did you?" Jake nodded slowly. The man sighed and shook his head. "That road's cursed. They say everyone who dies there stays there. Truckers, drivers, even hitchhikers. You're lucky you..." Jake didn't respond. He climbed back into his truck, determined to avoid Dead Man's Road for the rest of his life. But no matter how many miles he drove, he could never forget the cold, hollow eyes of the figures in the fog. And late at night, when the road was empty and the CB radio crackled with static, he sometimes thought he could hear Ray's voice, whispering a warning he would never ignore again. For weeks after the incident on Dead Man's Road, Jake couldn't shake the lingering sense of unease. He'd always been a rational man, grounded in reality, but what he had seen that night defied explanation. The company dispatcher called him one evening with a new assignment. "Got a long haul for you, Jake. East Coast run, straight through Pennsylvania." Jake hesitated. He hadn't driven much since the encounter, using excuses to stay on shorter routes, but he couldn't avoid the job forever. "Sure thing," he finally said. The route was straightforward, but a knot tightened in Jake's stomach as he realized it would take him dangerously close to the area where Dead Man's Road began. He told himself it wasn't the same stretch. This was a safer highway, farther south, but the memory of that foggy night stayed with him. The first day of the trip was uneventful. Jake stopped at familiar truck stops, chatted with other drivers, and caught a few hours of sleep in his cab. By the second night, he was deep in the Pennsylvania wilderness, where towns were few and far between, and the roads were lined with dense forests. Around midnight, Jake noticed something unusual. His CB radio, which had been quiet all night, crackled with faint static. It wasn't unusual for the radio to pick up interference in remote areas, but this time it felt different. "Jake, can you hear me?" Jake froze, his hands tightening on the wheel. It was Ray's voice again, just as he'd heard it weeks ago. "No," Jake whispered, shaking his head. "It's just static, nothing." The voice came again, clearer this time. "Jake, turn around, don't go any far." A chill ran down Jake's spine. He turned the CB dial to another channel, hoping to lose the interference, but the static followed. "Turn back now," the voice insisted, echoing through the cab. Jake slammed the CB radio off. His heart was pounding, and sweat beaded on his forehead. He considered stopping for the night, but the stretch of road he was on offered no pull-off areas. He had no choice but to keep going. The night grew darker, and a thick fog began to roll in. Jake cursed under his breath, the memory of Dead Man's Road flashing in his mind. "No way," he muttered, gripping the wheel. "It's just regular fog. Happens all the time." But as the fog thickened, Jake noticed something strange. The temperature inside the cab dropped sharply, and his breath began to mist. The headlights barely pierced the dense gray wall ahead. The road seemed to stretch on forever, the surrounding forest disappearing into the haze. Jake glanced at his GPS, but the screen was blank, just a loading icon spinning endlessly. His unease turned to outright fear when he spotted a figure on the side of the road. It was the woman in white. Her long dress billowed in the windless night, and her dark hair framed her pale, tear-streaked face. She stood perfectly still, watching him. Jake's foot hovered over the brake, but he couldn't bring himself to stop. He sped past her, refusing to look back. Moments later, the CB radio flickered to life again, even though he had turned it off. "She's coming for you, Jake," Ray's voice said, laced with urgency. Jake shouted, "What does she want? Who is she?" The voice didn't answer. The static faded, leaving Jake alone with the low hum of his engine and the suffocating silence of the fog. As Jake pressed forward, he saw faint headlights in his side mirror, another truck catching up to him. Relief flooded his chest. "Finally, someone else on the road," Jake muttered. He reached for the CB, hoping to contact the other driver. "Breaker 19, this is Big Rig. You got your ears on?" No response. The headlights grew brighter, closing the distance between them. Jake glanced at the rearview mirror and frowned. Something was off. The other truck looked ancient, its cab rusted and its headlights flickering erratically. Jake slowed slightly, hoping to let the phantom truck pass. Instead, it pulled up alongside him, matching his speed. He turned to look, and his blood ran cold. The other driver wasn't human. The figure behind the wheel had no face, just a smooth, featureless expanse of pale skin. Its hands were skeletal, gripping the wheel tightly. The figure turned its head toward Jake, as if acknowledging him, before the truck veered violently into his lane. Jake yanked the wheel, narrowly avoiding a collision. His tires screeched as he fought to regain control. When he looked again, the phantom truck was gone, as if it had never been there. The fog grew denser, and the road ahead seemed to twist and shift unnaturally. Jake checked his watch. It was stuck at 1:17 a.m., the same time he had first heard Ray's voice. Panic clawed at his chest. He slammed on the brakes, bringing the truck to a grinding halt. The silence was deafening. Jake stepped out of the cab, his boots crunching on the gravel shoulder. The fog pressed in around him, cold and suffocating. He shone his flashlight ahead, but the beam barely penetrated the gloom. "Hello?" he called, his voice echoing eerily. A shadow moved in the distance. Jake's heart raced as he strained to see. The shadow grew larger, closer, until it took shape, a procession of ghostly figures marching silently along the road. They were the dead. Men, women, and children, their faces pale and lifeless, their hollow eyes fixed on Jake. They carried with them an overwhelming sense of sorrow and pain. At the front of the procession was the woman in white. "You can't leave," she said, her voice echoing like a distant wind. "Not until you've paid your—" "What debt?" Jake shouted, backing away. She pointed at him, her skeletal finger trembling. "You've driven this road too long. You've taken shortcuts through our realm. Now you belong to—" "No," Jake whispered, stumbling back into his truck. He locked the doors and started the engine, but the ghostly figures surrounded the vehicle, their hands pressing against the window. The woman's face appeared inches from his, her eyes burning with otherworldly fire. "Drive, Jake. Drive until the road—" Jake floored the accelerator, his truck plowing through the fog. The figures disappeared into the haze, their screams echoing in his ear. The road seemed endless, looping back on itself no matter which way he turned. Jake's gas gauge edged toward empty, and despair threatened to overwhelm him. Just when he thought he would be trapped forever, he saw a faint light in the distance. It grew brighter, warmer, until it illuminated a familiar sign, Interstate 40, exit. Jake didn't question it. He barreled toward the exit, the fog finally thinning. As he merged onto the interstate, the cold lifted, and his watch ticked forward to 2:15 a.m. Jake pulled into the first truck stop he saw, parking his rig and collapsing against the wheel. His hands trembled, and his breath came in ragged gasps. For the rest of his career, Jake never drove near Deadman's Road again. And on long, lonely nights, when the fog rolled in and the CB crackled with static, he would pray that the ghosts of the highway had finally let him go. But deep down, he knew they were still waiting, biding their time until he returned to pay his debt. Weeks turned into months, but Jake couldn't escape the memories of that night. The haunting images of the faceless driver, the ghostly procession, and the woman in white lingered like shadows in his mind. Each time he passed through a foggy stretch of highway, he gripped the wheel tighter, expecting the spectral figures to reappear. Despite his efforts to stay away from Deadman's Road and its surrounding routes, Jake's trucking assignments often pulled him closer to the region. The Appalachian Mountains were unavoidable for many of the east to west hauls. Jake began hearing other truckers share chilling tales over the CB radio, stories of strange encounters and unexplained disappearances along isolated stretches of road. The stories made Jake uneasy, but he never joined the conversation. He knew better than to tempt fate by speaking of the ghosts aloud. One late autumn evening, Jake found himself in the Smoky Mountains, hauling a load of heavy machinery to a construction site in Asheville. He had deliberately chosen a route that avoided Route 68 by several dozen miles, but a detour sign forced him onto a narrow back road. His GPS beeped, recalculating the route. Jake glanced at the screen and froze. Deadman's Road, 2 miles ahead. No, Jake muttered, his pulse quickening. He stopped the truck and checked the map on his phone, but the alternative routes were hours longer, and he was already behind schedule. Taking a deep breath, Jake decided to press on. He told himself it wasn't Deadman's Road, just another unmarked highway with a bad reputation. He adjusted his seat, turned up the radio, and focused on the drive. It was nearly midnight when the CB radio crackled to life. "Jake!" the voice called, soft and distant. Jake's knuckles turned white on the wheel. He didn't. "Jake, you're heading the wrong way." It was Ray's voice again, unmistakable. Jake turned the radio off, but the static persisted. "Turn back," Ray urged, his tone more desperate. "They've been waiting for..." The radio went silent. About 20 minutes later, Jake approached a wooden bridge spanning a deep gorge. The sign at the entrance read, "Weight limit 10 tons." Jake's rig weighed more than double that, but the detour had left him no other option. "I've crossed worse," Jake muttered, easing the truck onto the creaking planks. Halfway across, a loud groan echoed from beneath the bridge. Jake's heart pounded as he heard the unmistakable sound of wood splintering. He pressed the gas pedal, urging the truck forward. Suddenly, the fog returned, rolling in like a tidal wave. It swallowed the truck, turning the bridge into an endless expanse of gray. The groaning grew louder, and Jake's headlights flickered. Then, figures emerged from the fog, walking toward the truck from the far side of the bridge. Their faces were pale and expressionless, their eyes fixed on Jake. Leading the group was the woman in white. "You should have stayed away," she said, her voice echoing inside Jake's mind. The planks beneath the truck gave way, and Jake's world tilted violently. The rig plunged into the gorge, the weightless sensation of falling gripping his chest. Jake braced for impact, but instead of crashing into the rocky depths, he found himself back on the road, the truck humming steadily beneath him. The fog was gone. He pulled over to the side of the road, his body trembling. His GPS showed that he was miles past the bridge, but he had no memory of crossing. Jake reached Asheville without further incident and delivered his load. As he sat in his truck, waiting for the paperwork to clear, he overheard 2 workers discussing a local. "They say the bridge on Deadman's Road collapsed years ago," one man said. "A trucker tried to cross it, and the whole thing fell into the gorge. Nobody survived." Jake felt a chill creep down his spine. He leaned out the window. "What did you say about the worker frowned. "Yeah, it's haunted or something. They closed it off, but some GPS systems still send people there by mistake. Spooky stuff." Jake yawned. He started the truck and drove away, vowing never to return to the region again. Even after retiring from trucking a few years later, Jake couldn't escape the haunting memories of Deadman's Road. The nightmares came frequently, filled with images of fog, ghostly figures, and the woman in white. One night, as he sat on the porch of his modest home in Missouri nursing a cold beer, he heard the faint rumble of a truck engine. The sound grew louder, echoing through the empty streets. Jake stood, his heart racing, and looked toward the road. There, at the end of his driveway, was an old, rusted truck. Its headlights flickered, and the cab was empty. Jake knew what it meant. "They've come for me," he whispered. The truck idled for a moment before slowly backing away, disappearing into the darkness. Jake didn't follow. He simply sat back down, knowing it was only a matter of time before the ghosts of Deadman's Road claimed what they were owed. From that night forward, Jake never heard the truck again, but deep in his heart, he knew the road wasn't finished with him. And it never would. Years passed, but Jake's mind never fully escaped the grip of Dead Man's Road. Even after he had retired from long-haul trucking and settled into a quieter life, the memories lingered, like the distant hum of a truck engine or the occasional flash of headlights in the corner of his vision. But he had convinced himself that he was safe, that the ghosts and the cursed road had finally let him go. But one cold winter evening, everything changed. Jake sat in his recliner, his body sore from the years of trucking, his eyes tired from the weight of restless sleep. He had been drinking a beer, staring into the dim light of his living room, when it happened. The unmistakable sound of a truck engine reverberated through the stillness of the night. It started as a low rumble, barely audible, but quickly grew louder. The familiar sound, so haunting, so unnerving, filled his ears. Jake's heart raced as he stood up and rushed to the window. He looked out into the darkness of the street. No truck, no headlights, just the snow-covered ground and the quiet stillness of the empty road. He blinked, confused. Was it just a trick of the wind? Had his mind finally snapped from the years of terror? But then, just as he was about to dismiss it, the truck appeared. It was an old rig, just like the one he had seen on Dead Man's Road. The headlights were dim and flickering, casting long, eerie shadows on the snow. The truck moved slowly, as if deliberately creeping toward his house. The engine's growl echoed through the night. Jake's breath caught in his throat. There was no doubt about it. This was no ordinary truck. It was the same one, the one from all those years ago. The truck came to a stop at the end of his driveway, its engine dying with an almost deliberate finality. For a moment, everything was still. Jake's pulse thundered in his ears. The door to the truck creaked open. He didn't want to look. He didn't want to acknowledge it, but he couldn't tear his eyes away. From the darkness of the cab emerged a figure, tall and thin, wearing a long white dress. Her face was pale, her hair wild and untamed, just as it had been all those years ago. The woman in white. She walked toward his front door, her bare feet barely touching the ground. Each step seemed to carry a heavy weight, as though the very air around her was charged with an unnatural energy. Her face was unreadable, but Jake knew that this was the moment he had dreaded. She stopped at the door. Jake's hands shook as he reached for the doorknob, but before he could open it, her voice reached him. She whispered, the same cold voice that had haunted him for so long. It's time to pay the price. Jake's heart skipped a beat. He tried to move, to flee, but his body was frozen. His breath came in short, ragged gasps, and the room seemed to close in on him. The woman's eyes met his through the glass. They were wide, empty, filled with sorrow and anger. You cannot outrun it, she said softly. The road has claimed you, and now you will join the other. Jake's mind raced. The truck, the ghosts, it was all real. It had never stopped following him. All these years he had thought he could escape, but he was wrong. He had been marked, and no matter how far he ran, the road would always find a way to pull him back. He stumbled back from the door, his legs weak beneath him. He looked desperately for an escape, but there was none. The woman in white moved closer, her hand outstretched. As she touched the door, the room seemed to shudder. The air grew thick, as if the house itself were suffocating under the weight of the... With a final, eerie whisper, the woman spoke the words that sealed his fate. Now you will never... The door flew open with a crash, and the figure stepped into the house, her presence consuming the entire room. And just like that, Jake was gone. The following morning, Jake's neighbors noticed something strange. His house, once warm and inviting, now stood dark and silent. His truck was parked outside, the engine cold. There were no signs of struggle, no evidence of anything out of the ordinary. But when the authorities arrived to check on him, they found nothing but an empty house. His bed had not been slept in, his belongings were untouched, and there was no sign of him anywhere. The only thing left behind was the faint smell of gasoline and the lingering sound of a truck engine in the distance. No one ever spoke of Dead Man's Road again, but those who knew Jake, the other truckers, the ones who had heard the stories, knew. Jake Carter, the seasoned trucker who had driven those cursed highways for years, had become one of the lost souls who wandered forever in the fog, his spirit trapped between the world of the living and the ghosts of the road. And as the years passed, the story of Jake and Deadman's Road faded into legend, becoming just another warning whispered among truckers. But the road still called to those who dared drive too far, and the woman in white continued to wait for her next victim. Because, as they say, the road never forgets. The highway stretched out before Jack like a black ribbon under a starless sky. He had been driving trucks for over 15 years, but this trip felt different. Jack wasn't one to spook easily, but something about this route, the long, lonely stretches and the stories he'd heard, put him on edge. He was hauling a refrigerated load across the back roads of Wyoming, a shortcut suggested by his dispatcher. The roads were narrower and less traveled, saving him time. But as the clock struck midnight, Jack began to regret taking this path. The night was unusually quiet. The hum of his truck's engine was the only sound. Even the usual wildlife, the chirp of crickets, the rustle of leaves seemed absent. Jack adjusted his rearview mirror and glanced at the load behind him. The trailer loomed large, its refrigerated unit humming softly. Just another trip, Jack muttered to himself. He turned up the radio, hoping the country music station would keep him awake. Static crackled. The signal was gone. "Figures," he said with a sigh, punching the radio off. A road sign appeared out of the darkness, its letters faded and barely visible. Witchwood Hollow, 20 miles. Jack frowned. He didn't remember seeing that name on his map, but there was no turning back now. The next rest stop wasn't for another 50 miles. He pressed on, the truck's headlights cutting through the thick darkness. About 10 miles into Witchwood Hollow, Jack noticed something odd. The trees lining the road grew denser, their gnarled branches reaching overhead like skeletal fingers. The headlights seemed to dim, as if the darkness was swallowing the light. Jack rubbed his eyes, thinking fatigue was playing tricks on him. That's when he saw it. A figure stood in the middle of the road, directly in his path. Jack slammed on the brakes, the tires screeching against the asphalt. The truck groaned to a halt, the trailer swaying behind him. Heart pounding, Jack leaned forward, squinting through the windshield. The figure didn't move. It was a man, or at least it looked like one. He wore a tattered coat, and his face was obscured by a wide-brimmed hat. Jack rolled down his window. "Hey, you okay?" he called out. The man didn't answer. Instead, he raised one hand and pointed down the road. Jack hesitated. Something about the man felt wrong, but he couldn't just leave him there. He honked the horn, the sound echoing in the still night. The man didn't flinch. "Fine," Jack muttered, gripping the steering wheel. He inched the truck forward, expecting the man to step aside. But as the truck moved closer, the man vanished. Jack slammed the brakes again, his breath caught in his throat. He stared at the empty road, his mind racing. Had he imagined it? He scanned his mirrors, but there was no sign of the man. "You're just tired," he told himself, though the words didn't comfort him. He checked the clock, 12:45 a.m., just a few more hours to go. As he drove on, the air inside the cab grew colder. Jack adjusted the heater, but it didn't help. His breath fogged the windshield, forcing him to wipe it with his sleeve. The cold seemed to seep into his bones. A loud thud echoed from the trailer, making Jack jump. He glanced in his side mirrors, but the road behind him was empty. The sound came again, louder this time, like something pounding on the trailer walls. "Probably just the load shifting," Jack said aloud, though he didn't believe it. He pulled over, his tires crunching on the gravel shoulder. Grabbing a flashlight, he stepped out into the freezing air. The night was eerily silent as Jack walked toward the trailer. The beam of his flashlight cut through the darkness, illuminating the frost-covered side of the truck. He unlocked the trailer doors and swung them open. Cold mist billowed out, and Jack squinted into the dim interior. The load was intact, boxes of frozen meat stacked neatly. Nothing seemed out of place. He stepped closer, his boots clanging against the metal floor. A sudden gust of wind slammed the trailer doors shut behind him. Jack whipped around, the flashlight shaking in his hand. He tried the handle, but the door wouldn't budge. "Come on," he growled, yanking harder. The metal was ice cold, stinging his fingers. The pounding started again, but this time it wasn't from the trailer, it was coming from outside. Jack froze, his breath catching in his throat. The sound grew louder, rhythmic, like footsteps circling the truck. He pressed his ear to the trailer wall, straining to listen. A low whisper filled the air. It was faint at first, like the rustle of leaves, but it grew louder, forming words Jack couldn't understand. He backed away from the wall, his heart racing. The whispering stopped. For a moment there was only silence. Then, something slammed against the trailer, hard enough to rattle the walls. Jack stumbled, his flashlight clattering to the floor. He scrambled to pick it up, the beam flickering as he shone it toward the door. Jack's blood ran cold as the door creaked open. He stared, too terrified to move, as a shadowy figure stepped inside. It was the man from the road, his wide-brimmed hat casting a dark shadow over his face. "You shouldn't be here," the man said, his voice a guttural rasp. Jack stumbled backward, nearly tripping over the boxes. What do you want?" he stammered. The man didn't answer. Instead, he raised a skeletal hand and pointed at Jack. The temperature dropped further, frost forming on the walls of the trailer. Jack's breath came in ragged gasps, the air too cold to breathe. I'm just passing through," Jack said, his voice trembling. "I didn't mean to." The man took a step forward, his boots echoing against the metal floor. Jack backed away until he was pressed against the far wall. The shadow loomed closer, and Jack's flashlight flickered, the beam struggling against the darkness. With a final surge of courage, Jack grabbed a metal rod from the trailer floor and swung it at the figure. The rod passed through the man as if he weren't there, the force of the swing throwing Jack off balance. The shadow engulfed him. When Jack woke, he was slumped in the cab of his truck. The sun was rising, its golden light filtering through the trees. His hands trembled as he gripped the steering wheel, his clothes damp with sweat. The road ahead was empty, stretching into the distance. Jack glanced at the clock. It was 6 a.m. He started the engine and drove, the events of the night replaying in his mind. When he reached the next rest stop, he checked the trailer. The load was untouched, the boxes exactly where they had been. But Jack knew he hadn't imagined it. As he closed the trailer doors, he noticed something etched into the frosted metal. A single word, scrawled in jagged letters: leave. Jack didn't take shortcuts anymore.